All right. Like Caroline said, I'm a biologist with the U.S. Forest Service. I've been here on the Dillon Ranger District since about 2007. My whole career so far, which hasn't been as long as maybe it should have if I weren't playing and goofing off in my 20s, has been spent on the White River National Forest, and the majority of that on the Dillon Ranger District, a little bit over on the Holy Cross District. And I started getting really passionate about this idea of landscape connectivity after project after project that would come into our office, and it was, you know, a little bit here and just a few trees we were going to take down here for a driveway and a little expansion here and some more recreation trails, and let's connect some more up here. And I kept seeing, and in addition to that, you know, as you guys have seen, or people, who's from here? How about that? Let's see. Okay. You guys have seen, or folks that have been coming here for years have seen the immense development that has occurred over the past 15, 20 years. This place has changed, 5 years even, vastly different than it was years ago. So we're talking about town development, more workforce housing that's needed. So those little bits of habitat that are just slowly kind of going away, we refer to that in the Forest Service as kind of a death by 1,000 cuts. So it's just a little bit, and it's trying to balance that need between what we need to be here in the community and be able to be here to enjoy those values that we're here for, such as viewing wildlife. We want to still have that opportunity, but also providing the needs for our resources, which includes wildlife and habitat for our other animals out there. So I started looking at that thinking, you know, if we just keep taking and taking and taking and not doing something big picture that really addresses this issue, then I think we're going to be out of luck here. And the whole reason that we live here and that we play here and that we want to be here will be, a lot of the reason will be gone. Those animals that we want to see in the future may not be here. They may abandon us. The trees and the forest that we love to see, that solitude that we love to get, may not be here. So started looking at a little bit larger picture. How do we get these animals from point A to point B when you've got a ski area to go around and a town to get through and an extensive network of recreation trails that we all love to enjoy, and then across another highway and up and over the mountains. That's a lot to contend for animals. So we got together and formed a Summit County Safe Passages, and we're going to dive into that a little bit further, but that's kind of where my passion started coming into play, and I've kind of run with it with this project. But before we dive into Summit County Safe Passages specifically, we're going to start big, and we're going to talk about connectivity and what wildlife connectivity is and why wildlife need connectivity. Why do they need to move? How could I see elk out there all the time? I see bears all the time. It looks to me like they're doing just fine, some folks might say. So let's talk about what their needs are and how roads may be impacting what their needs are. So we're going to start big, and then we're going to kind of drill down to what folks are doing across the world for wildlife connectivity, some examples, and then bring it home to Colorado to talk about what we're doing here in our state. And then we're going to talk about specifically Summit County, what we're doing here with our efforts to preserve wildlife connectivity and to make our roads safer for motorists and for our wildlife, so that it's a balance and a win-win for everyone. Sound good? And if you have a burning question, if there's something that just does not make sense and you need some quick clarification, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we can have a really extensive dialogue and Q&A at the end of this session. I'm happy to stay here until Caroline kicks me out, which hopefully by 1:30, and answer questions and talk. And I'd love to get you guys involved because this is my thing. So I'm happy to be here for you guys. All right. So in a lot of cases, in unfragmented habitat, we've got animals that can move freely, right? They don't have any boundaries, but when you go and then the way that they move is mostly dictated by the terrain. You've got rocky slopes, you've got drainages, so they might follow those natural paths, and we can kind of predict through modeling or just intuition after observation where these animals are most likely to be moving and how they're going to be moving through the terrain based on what kind of species it is and what the topography and the terrain looks like. However, you throw some roads into that landscape and it's a whole new ball game. The movements become restrained, and then not just the footprint of the road, but it's the traffic that the roads carry can act as barriers to wildlife. And this is right up on Eastvale Pass, and these elk come down here, and this is on some of the wildlife monitoring cameras that we've done up there that we'll talk a little bit more about. Sometimes wildlife will still try and cross the roads, especially if it's not a real heavily traveled road like our forest roads. Sometimes there's still lots of roads out there that don't see a lot of traffic. So you might get these animals that will cross the roads and they do it successfully. Like this mama lynx and with her kittens out here. However, it's when you get into the higher traffic areas where you get those direct conflicts with traffic that animals are having. And wildlife vehicle collisions can result in direct wildlife mortality, property damage, human injury, and then sometimes human fatalities as well. And that's where the conflict is. So we see all kinds of different animals that are out here. Deer are probably the one that you're most familiar with. We've got deer, and especially back east, deer populations are kind of out of control. We have a lot of mule deer here in western Colorado as well. But there's other populations and other animals that are trying to cross. You know, you might have mountain lions, and this is a lynx. This is on Eastvale Pass. And bears, the larger carnivores that are trying to make more of those long-range dispersal movements or breeding movements. So they're not as high in numbers, but they're still trying to get across as well, and it's just as important. So they don't have as high in numbers, which can oftentimes mean a larger impact to the population because you've got fewer animals in that population versus like a mule deers that we see on a really regular basis. So here's some pretty staggering statistics. We're talking nationwide statistics right here. Invertebrates here, 1 million vertebrates killed on the roads every day. That's anywhere from birds all the way up to humans and everything in between. And then 1.5 million reported collisions with large animals each year, 200 fatalities, human fatalities, and then 29,000 injuries each year. Pretty staggering. And this is an example of, we've got a mama moose here and her young trying to get across a highway, an interstate, probably just trying to get, within her territory, maybe trying to get to a water resource or a foraging area or a place for cover. But this is what they're contending with, is a highway in the middle of their range, their home range. So let's drill down to Colorado. So in Colorado specifically, 3,600 wildlife vehicle accidents reported. Now remember that, reported each year. 266 with human injuries, 66.4 million. This number, we keep updating this number. Every time we go in and do a presentation, this number gets higher and higher. Every year we do this. $66.4 million in wildlife vehicle collisions for property damage, injuries, and fatalities. They're talking emergency response vehicles, insurance, all of the associated costs that go into dealing with wildlife vehicle collisions every year. Keep that number in mind when we get later into the show and talk a little bit about what the cost of a wildlife crossing structure is. $66.4 million in Colorado for injuries and associated property damage. And then this is the number of reported wildlife vehicle collisions. There is about twice as many unreported wildlife vehicle collisions in Colorado, at least, each year. So this is just the ones that call into state patrol or where there's an accident and somebody's called to the scene. How many carcasses do you see on the side of the road where people, who's been in a wildlife vehicle collision? Did every single one of you call someone?
Nope.
Right. Those are the unreported ones. Yes? No? So there you go. There's your 50-50, like almost twice as many. So not that that's a bad thing, but we just know that the rates are much higher than what's reported that's out there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about connectivity. Why do animals need to move? What do you guys think? Why do they need to move? Why do we need to move? It's the same reasons that we need to go about. Nowadays, if I want to find a mate, if I want to go on a date, I have to drive to Denver. And I think that's crazy, but that's what we have to do. These animals will travel hundreds of miles sometimes to find a mate. That's not lazy. That's what they'll do to find a mate. So there's mating needs. There's to find the right breeding habitat. They may be migrating from their summer elevation high in the mountains down to the valleys in the wintertime, or vice versa. They might need that cover. So they might be out in the meadows and they may need to get into the timber for that hiding cover or to find thermal cover, whatever it is. Lots of reasons for animals to be on the move. They can't just have everything in one spot. They're going to have to move just like we do to find different things. We go to the grocery store, we head to Denver, we do all kinds of different things to fulfill our needs for our niche. So it's the same thing with animals. They've got to move, and that involves crossing roads most of the time. More of a concern these days is adapting to climate change. If you're a pika or high elevation animal, you might need to start moving further up the mountain and finding new areas to reside there. Or habitat conditions due to development. You might need to just move your home because your home has been invaded with construction equipment, or it's not as big as it used to be, so you might need to go somewhere else to find a larger territory that's suitable for you. This is crazy. Look at how many roads we have in the United States. 4 million miles of roads, 276 million registered vehicles as of last year. In Colorado, 9,100 miles of roads, and that includes the county and municipal roads. And then in addition, we've got 20,000 miles of national forest roads, and then you've got BLM roads and Park Service roads and all the other roads out there as well. And those are usually less traveled roads and slower speeds, but they're still roads that may not be a big deal for a bear to dart across, but what if you're a turtle or a mouse? That's a much larger, acts as a much larger fragmented piece of habitat than it would for a bigger animal. So consider the size of the animal as well. All right, and we'll just briefly go through this. So you're not talking about just the footprint of the road. You're not talking about just the road and maybe the vegetation that's cleared to the side of it. But from that road, you've got, I don't know if anyone lives near a highway, but that noise from the highway or even just a county road can travel so far. So you've got noise disturbance and light disturbance here in Colorado or any states where you've got snow removal, you've got mag chloride and salt on the roads, and that removal and the runoff and the impacts of that can be much further reaching than just the roadside itself. So look at the difference between just the footprint of the road and the actual effects and how many acres of habitat or hectares of habitat that it can affect. That's a big difference. That's all habitat that may not be usable for a lot of animals. It may not affect all animals equally, but just some food for thought there. All right, so when animals are crossing road, they can do one of three things. They can approach the road and say, no thanks, that's too scary for me, I'm just gonna hang out over here, which oftentimes happens on Interstate 70. They can say, there's a lady over there and she's totally worth it and I'm just gonna give it a shot, I'm going for it. And then they don't make it. So we see those, and those are our wildlife vehicle collisions that are either reported or unreported. And then we have the proportion of animals that actually make it across successfully. So they're taking their chances there. If we build a wildlife crossing structure, let me catch up to my slides here, make sure I'm giving you all the information, although I think you're good here. if we were to build a wildlife crossing structure, an overpass or an underpass, a way to separate the animals from the highway where they didn't have to conflict with the highway and the traffic whatsoever, they've got a couple of options here. So you decrease the amount of animals that are avoiding the road. They're like, hey, I haven't been over there in decades. Maybe you've got genetic flow that can actually start mixing again, especially for places like the interstates, Interstate 70, where we see well over 25,000 vehicles traveling this highway per day. So you've got that. You've got much fewer or next to nothing for animals that are actually getting killed on the highway, which is also making it a lot safer for all of us that are traveling out there as well. And then you've got a really high success rate of animals that are crossing the road. So any reason we shouldn't be building wildlife crossing structures? I don't know. Okay, so a few examples of what wildlife overpasses can look like. Banff, leading the way. I'm not sure where this one came from. I'll admit that I stole this slide from my colleague, Julia, and not sure where this one came from either, but they can look very different depending on where they are. Underpasses, another option. Depends on the target species that you're looking for. Some animals don't care. They like the overpasses. Some animals prefer the seclusion of an underpass. It really just depends on the location and the target species that you're building the structures for. Moose in general, don't give a rip. They'll go either way. But deer and elk especially tend to be a little more sensitive. And if they can see all the way through, you see how they're crossing under this one here, and they can see this other bridge that they can see all the way through. They say, okay, I know it's safe over there. Nothing's gonna get me. I'm good. It's kind of like me when I go through a dark tunnel. I prefer to see what's on the other side. And then you've also got span bridges, and we see these on parts of our highway as well, which is pretty neat. So that's a way that engineers can start redesigning highways, or when they're doing wildlife transportation or highway transportation projects, they can keep this in mind. Instead of putting a fill slope in there, they can put a span bridge in so that animals can flow underneath the flow of traffic. There are very unique creatures out there that still migrate and need unique ways of crossing the road. Has anyone ever been to Christmas Island National Park? I haven't. It's on my list though because of this. So a very uniquely designed wildlife overpass specifically for these crabs when they migrate from the upland to the coast every year. These are Christmas crabs that are heading to the coast. Yeah, so, and if you look it up on YouTube, you'll see they go through the streets and they're sweeping crabs off the street so that they don't get crushed by cars. But this is a really innovative way, and they even have like miniature fencing here to guide them to the crossing. It's pretty cool. Another one in North Carolina. Anyone here from North Carolina? Okay, keep an eye out for these. Flying squirrels, they don't actually fly, but they do glide from branch to branch. So with these roads in their habitat here, they put these poles up to try and provide them a way to cross the roads through the canopy, because they live in the canopy of the trees, that they can still move through the forest and across the road through their habitat. And they're finding that these are working. So it seems like a pretty inexpensive, pretty easy way to move habitat, or to move animals from point A to point B in their habitat. This one's pretty awesome too. It looks just like a drainage area, but it's a wildlife underpass for amphibians. And amphibians are delicate. They need to have the same climate in their outside world as they do in their skin. So this allows the sunlight and the moisture to come through the grate so that they can cross underneath the road. And then you've got these lips here on the side of the guide wall that will direct them into the tunnel so that they can cross the streets as well, because amphibians are kind of a big deal these days. They're susceptible to disease and they're on the decline. So We want to protect those as much as possible. So it really is all about the species that you're looking at protecting, what landscape you're in. You got to think about their mobility, their physiology, what their needs are, and what's going to work best for them. All right, in Colorado, I know you can't see all the numbers here, and that's not really the point. I just wanted you guys to kind of see what's happening in Colorado. Gives you a general idea of where we have wildlife crossings and where we don't. And I will give you a disclaimer here. For instance, this is Summit County. This is where we are here. It says that it looks like we're doing awesome things. The wildlife crossing structures that were built here were built a very long time ago. And engineers and biologists were doing the best they could with the knowledge that they had at the time. That knowledge has come a really long way in the past 20, 25 years or so. These crossing structures, and I can't speak for the other counties, but the crossing structures that we have here are not very effective. Some of them have riprap rocks going down into them, and they're very dark, tight tunnels. They're not quite big enough for our antlered animals to get through, like a big moose, since our moose population has really expanded over the past few years, or a big antlered elk. So we're working on that in Summit County, but the vast majority of Colorado does not have wildlife crossing structures. So there's a lot of folks, there's a lot of movement around this right now in Colorado. There's studies going on the west slope. West of the Continental Divide. That study is moving to the east slope. There's stuff going on in our neighboring county in Eagle County Safe Passages. So they're doing a similar process that we went through here in Summit County. So just give you an idea of what's happening here. Another place that we are seeing some progress is down in the southwest corner. There's a little bit more happening there. So this is just a simple culvert. And this is one of the first designated crossing structures built in Colorado in the 70s. It's on I-60. And then there's a half mile of fencing on either side to keep the animals off the highway that guides them to the structure. This is probably not something we would build today. We would probably recommend a much larger structure, maybe even a concrete arch, an arch culvert, so that you can accommodate as many large ungulates as possible. But hey, you can get small mammals across here, so that's a really good start. On I-70, on the west side of I-70, as you top over Vail Pass and head into the town of Vail, there's a lot of span bridges there. So what happened here is when I-70 was being constructed, they were cruising along, building from east to west, and on the east side, they weren't thinking with wildlife in mind as much. They were filling in the gaps. As they got into the top, they started designing these bridges with wildlife in mind a little bit more, and instead of filling this stuff in, they started designing it so that you could actually have animals move underneath. So there's pretty decent permeability underneath I-70 on the west side. On the east side, we're lacking a little bit, especially on the westbound lanes. But we're going to talk about that here shortly and what we're doing about that. But span bridges act as a fantastic wildlife underpass for all animals. And then this one is a relatively new one. Last year, I want to say. So there were a few decades when Colorado, where very little was done to incorporate the wildlife considerations and transportation projects, but in the last 10 years or so, the trend has shifted, and we're really starting to reconsider things. Biologists and engineers are working together again to really make this a priority. This is a more recently constructed arch culvert, and this is between Montrose and Ridgeway in Colorado. Got turkeys coming through. It's kind of neat. And yeah, if you can click that, cool. Just 3 minutes of your time. If you haven't seen this video, it's pretty neat. It's a 5-minute video. We're just going to watch the first 3 minutes of it.
Each year, thousands of drivers collide with wildlife across Colorado. Along with the severe impacts to wildlife populations, these collisions often result in expensive damages serious injuries, and even fatalities to motorists. According to the Colorado Department of Transportation, more than 3,000 wildlife vehicle collisions have been reported annually in the last decade, a statistic that's likely to continue with Colorado's booming population. In an effort to reduce these deadly and costly accidents and protect wildlife, CDOT, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, local municipalities, and landowners joined forces to develop a series of wildlife crossings on Highway 9 in Grand County. Consisting of 2 overpass bridges and 5 underpasses, the corridors allow wildlife to safely cross the highway without risk to motorists. The project also includes more than 20 miles of wildlife fencing, along with openings to guide wildlife into the crossings. Highway engineers also designed more than 60 wildlife escape ramps in the unlikely event that an animal gets trapped on the highway. The ambitious and innovative accident mitigation project is the first of its kind in Colorado. Highway 9, which runs between Silverthorne and Kremling, is notorious for collisions. The narrow, 11-mile stretch of 2-lane road cuts through the heart of prime deer and elk habitat, blocking the big game animals' key movement corridors. More than 650 vehicle-wildlife collisions have been reported in the last decade, most of them involving mule deer. Tragically, 16 people have been killed and around 200 motorists have been injured on this deadly highway in the last 20 years. Although research is ongoing, officials say the first construction phase of this project, which included just 4 crossings in 2015, has already reduced collisions by more than 90%. Wildlife managers believe this positive trend will continue now that the entire project is finished and deer and elk become comfortable using all 7 crossings as part of their seasonal migration routes.
We've been really happy in our first year of monitoring. We've seen an 82 to 98% success rate of animals approaching the structures, either the underpasses or the overpasses, and crossing and using those structures. That's exceeded our expectations over what we thought we would be seeing. Typically there is a time period that it takes for the animals to get acclimated. It could be anywhere from a year to maybe 5 years. With the success that we're seeing here, I'm not sure that the animals are hesitating that much at these structures. The mule deer have really taken right to the structures and are using them on a daily basis.
In addition to
but you could see the structures being built, a 90% reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions, and there were 7 structures built with this Highway 9 project. Has anyone driven that section? And we're talking Highway 9, pretty amazing. A little safer, a little less sketchy to drive, especially at night. So fantastic success. And these are the same colleagues that are working on this Summit County Safe Passages project with us. So that should give you good hope there. Just wanted to give you that clip. So let's talk a little bit about State Highway 9 because that's the one that's in our backyard, and it's so cool that we have that there to see how successful it's been, to build on it and be able to replicate that success here. So we've got winter range and year-round habitat for mule deer and for elk in that valley. You've got daily crossings here. So these orange dots, it doesn't look like a dot, it looks like a straight line because there's so many dots. These were crossings before the construction of animals going across. It was basically just sheet flow of animals crossing this section of Highway 9. Let's see. In 5 years before construction, 133 wildlife vehicle collisions reported, 17 injuries, 3 fatalities. That's just in the 5 years. And in the video, they talked about 16 fatalities in this stretch of highway. That was much longer span than just 5 years. And then that's just the reports. Again, over twice as many carcasses were actually picked up. So that's animals that were hit and that weren't reported. And this is just for mule deer. This is after this past, they haven't analyzed 2019, a big winter yet. So we'll be interested to see what those results say. But from last year, 45,000 successful mule deer crossings. So the blue, it doesn't really matter with the blue, like these are total movements. So animals that either approached and maybe didn't turn and maybe turned back. And these are ones that crossed successfully. So there were a few animals that approached and didn't cross, but very few, and most of them actually crossed successfully. So 45,000 times that those were animals that were not on the highway. Here's phase 1 construction. Here's phase 2 construction. This is your average amount of roadkill. And then you see how it plummets down to here. This is the first phase of construction, only half of the 11 miles done. And then after the second phase. So you went down to 6 average carcasses per year, down from 56 and a half. I don't know where you get a half from on a carcass, but I don't know how that works. That's why I'm not in research. So how do we do that in Summit County? This is where the cool stuff comes in to me. It's all been cool, but this is where it brings it down to our community. All right, so in Summit County, like I said, we started focusing on what can we do at a landscape level to make some differences here. So we embarked on a process to develop these maps and modeling habitat, and I had a little bit of extra money that came from a mitigation project from CDOT, and with that money I hired Julia Kench and I hired Bill Rudiger, who are 2 fantastic road ecologists and biologists, to help me identify where the habitat was, where animals were likely crossing based on their movements and what our target species were, and then to figure out where our wildlife vehicle collisions were highest. We didn't have to do a lot of research for this. We didn't recreate the wheel. We took the existing data that was already out there and then went out into the field to verify it. And we also gathered up all the stakeholders who drive these roads. We looked at, we pulled in our ski areas, we pulled in our towns, we pulled in counties, or the county, nonprofits. We took all this data and said, does this seem right to you guys? We did the modeling and we have the research to use all this, but what are you guys seeing out there? And we kind of went back and forth and verified it with our stakeholders. And then with our stakeholders as well, we said, what do you guys want to see out of this plan? What makes the most sense? What do we don't want this to be a document that came from the Forest Service that says, well, you can't build here and you got to build something here and thou shalt not do this. This is a community document. This is our whole county and our community is vested in this interest. So we set out on the project with the goal of recognizing that from the outset that connectivity isn't just about where wildlife cross roads, but it's ensuring that our wildlife has the freedom to roam across the landscape and to access the habitat that they need, but also recognizing there's a big human component to this, especially here in Summit County. We've got folks that come here to stay and that people are traveling through, heading over to Vail and heading to Moab and heading west to the national parks, and this is a huge thoroughfare, and what do we want to see out of this? So that's what we did. We made this community document, and there's a copy of it sitting up here on the table that you're welcome to take a look at. It's also available on our website. A little bit of how we did it. We based it on wildlife criteria. What's the wildlife value? Are they threatened and endangered species? What type of habitat is there? What do the wildlife vehicle collisions look like? How safe or how unsafe is this area? And then how feasible is it? Do we have an opportunity to do something here? These are our stakeholders, and there's a lot more actually. We've grown a lot since then too. And it's really diverse. We've got agencies, we've got local municipalities, we've got ski areas, we have nonprofit and conservation organizations, and then our most important group are our citizens, our local citizens that are involved and that have buy-in on this and that are excited about this and want to be involved. So we recommend some of the best areas for potential crossing structures. We also identify other areas where it's not feasible to build a wildlife crossing structure. So there's some areas that you just flat out can't build one, or maybe it doesn't make sense to, but you can also recommend, hey, in this area, let's make sure the land on either side stays in public hands so that it doesn't become developed. Or maybe we don't do, maybe if there's an opportunity that comes along, we could look at rezoning this area or maintain this wildlife corridor for some reason. There's lots of other recommendations besides just building wildlife corridors in there. Would you like to pop that door open? Thank you. Just for a tiny bit of airflow. Thank you so much. And out of all of the areas that we looked at in Summit County, all of the roads, we came up with about 17 areas. Well, everybody thought that every single inch of road was important to preserve, but we had to narrow it down. So 17 was the big number we got to. And of those, there are 3 that we wanted to move forward on right now because either there's a big threat or there's a good opportunity or it's kind of lower hanging fruit, and we had some good partners to work with. So those are the ones I wanted to touch on really quick.
Stakeholders?
Yeah, absolutely. So stakeholders to me and to our group are people who are vested in the interest of wanting to see this movement go forward and so it's everybody that's been involved. Partners, stakeholders, I think that's a little bit interchangeable. The stakeholders initially were the folks who gave direct input on how they wanted to see this plan developed and how they could use it. So it's a document that is it's a guide. It's a document that's a guidance document that you can use to help guide you with management and land management decisions. And so there were folks that could help tailor to that document and the needs and what we wanted to see out of that document. Since that document has been created, the stakeholder group has grown even more. So there are folks that are working with us on our teams. There are landowners that might have property in areas where we've recommended linkages. They are anyone who's interested and who has been involved, really. Yes?
Do the animal passages go out of this county? Do they go further?
We don't have any in Summit County yet. So the ones that are on Highway 9 are in Grand County.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're wanting to get some.
What about the migration? Is it far?
It depends. It depends on the animal, and it depends on where. There are some animals who migrate out of the county and come back in, and there are some, because there's so much fragmentation, that are year-round residents that don't really go very far in the county because they're like, well, if I migrate, I've got to cross I-70, so maybe I'll just stay here for the winter and find some good lower elevation range. So you don't see as much in the southern part of Summit County of the long range migration movements with the ungulates, with the deer and elk, as you used to. On the northern part of the county, you still see some of those longer range movements. Maybe they're moving in and out of the Blue River Valley a little bit longer than the animals in the southern part. It all depends on the species and where they're located. Yeah.
I know there's tons of elk up in Meeker.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still true?
Yeah, there's a lot of elk there. Mm-hmm. And that's not an area that we are looking at with this project, but there are other groups that are looking at doing wildlife crossing structures in that area as well, because that's an important segment and population of elk that they want to maintain for hunting as well. Yeah. So the priority areas that we're looking at are, there's that map again, Lower Blue River area, Upper Blue near the Goose Tarn pasture, and then east side of Vale Pass. I'm going to skip a little bit just to save some time. Lower Blue area, lots of elk, lots of deer, same type of issues that occur like in Grand County with the winter range. So we are looking at potentially tying into the Grand County project on that side. We're actually heading out into the field with some engineers on Monday to start refining where those sites could be. So stay tuned on that one. We have a linkage team specifically that works in this area. Upper Blue near the Goose Tarn, huge increase in moose collisions on State Highway 9 near the town of Blue River. So we are working locally with the governments there and the towns, and hopefully with the residents real soon to start just the education process, because we've got a real threat of residential and recreational development in that area. We want to make sure that that connectivity is maintained as things move forward in that section. Eastvale Pass. This is an area that we have a lot of opportunity to move forward on right now. And who would think that putting structures across I-70 would be your lowest hanging fruit? But it has been. We have actually raised money in this area. We have a lot of partners. We've done a lot of wildlife monitoring for the past 5 years, wildlife cameras within 400 feet of where the roads are to find out which animals are approaching the highways and potentially could be crossing if there were structures there. So you can see Rocky Mountain Wild, CDOT, Denver Zoo, Friends of Dillon Ranger District, Friends of Eagles Nest Wilderness, A Basin, Copper, and Vail Resorts are all involved in this section. Muley Fanatic Foundation, Parks and Wildlife, Forest Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service are just some of our partners in this area, to name a few. This summer, starting in August, we'll be kicking off an engineering feasibility study. So CDOT will be out there with a consultant working on the 3 proposed crossing structures that we recommended in our Safe Passages plan to look at where the exact dimensions and exact locations of these structures could go. And we are talking about 3 structures on the westbound lanes only, because the eastbound lanes, bear with me here, it's a divided highway on that side. So we talked about the span bridges earlier. There's span bridges on the eastbound lanes so animals can move across under there. On the westbound lanes, animals have to dart across the road and keep their fingers crossed. So we're looking at putting in 2 underpasses and an overpass on the westbound lanes between Copper Mountain and the top of Vail Pass. And this summer, we will get a lot more information from our engineers on what's feasible. It's going to refine the cost of what that's going to look like, along with wildlife fencing. And so we are going to continue our campaign of raising funds for that. So far, we've had Vail Resorts, A Basin, and the Center for Large Landscape Conservation donate over $200,000 to help us with that study. That's just the beginning, though. We're going to keep needing a lot more money to finish the design to get it to a shelf-ready project. Once it's shelf-ready, we finish the design, it raises to a much higher level in the queue for constructability. That's when CDOT says, hey, nice work, you guys. You've done your legwork. Your community really wants this. You know what? I think we'll back you on this. And that's when they step in and make that a higher priority on their list of projects to make happen. So that's where we are with the Vail Pass linkage area. We call it the Vail Pass Wildlife Byway. So you'll be seeing more on that. I probably just skipped through 10 slides here. Let's see.
Is there a way for the public to look at those animal cameras?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked. Actually, we've got business cards up here. If you go to our website, we've got a page on the Vail Pass Wildlife Byway, and there is a link to the citizen science program that we use. You can go out in the field with Rocky Mountain Wild, help them monitor cameras, change cameras out. And then there's also stuff that you can do from your computer at home where you can help them identify all of the animals that they've captured on film, which is a lot. So this is just a map of the areas we talked about: an underpass, an overpass. This is Copper Mountain. This is heading up towards the top of Vail Pass here. The cool thing, you've got wilderness on one side, national forest on the other. So you've got pretty good, pristine habitat on either side. It's a great location for these structures to be implemented. We're really excited for this. So this is the overpass location. Pretty cool. You'd have an overpass here. See the span bridge back here? Would connect right up to that span bridge. So it'd be an over-under. So, like I said, $205,000 already contributed. We're going to have a refined cost estimate and exact locations, dimensions, and some marketing materials that come out of this study hopefully by the winter. We'll start campaign fundraising. This is the monitoring I talked about. That's done with Rocky Mountain Wild and our partner Denver Zoo. They've been fantastic. They're so fun to work with. So if you want to get out in the field and see what we're doing out there, I recommend that you get with these guys and sign up for a volunteer day. It's a lot of fun. We're going to skip that one. That's what I have for you guys. I wanted to just take questions and flip through. These are some of the creatures that have shown up on the cameras that are all right there within the highway corridor. So, you know, when you're zipping past, just think about all of these guys that are right there next to you that you don't even know are there. So, questions, dialogue, let's talk. Yes?
When do you expect to actually implement?
As soon as you write me a check for as much as we need. But once we get to design, the design phase is done, which the rough estimate on the design phase is about $1 million right now, it becomes shelf ready. We are working with our Intermountain transportation team as well. We're heading there July 19th with our county representatives, also Bentley Henderson, to talk more about this project and to let them know where we are. That sends it a little higher in the queue as well. So once we get the citizens and some help funding that design and the design is finished, like I said, it raises to a much higher level of constructability at that point, but we're still going to need some funds. We'll have some matching opportunities at that point as well. I had a question here. Yeah.
We traveled to Kremlin, you know,
Uh-huh.
the road a lot and watched the whole, and lived through the construction. How was that section funded and about what did it cost?
That is a great question, and I have a slide for that. And there's all our animals. Oh, there's a lynx. They're not mythical, they do exist. They're not expanding or there's a few. There's a handful of them. And they're probably never going to be more than a handful or so at any given time. But at the end of all this, I do have that slide on the funding. So that was a highway transportation project in Highway 9. It wasn't just for the wildlife crossing structures. They did a lot of, yeah, the road was in bad shape. They added some turn lanes. They did some, so this was kind of the process. But there was, so here was the funding, how it broke down. 2.1 in private donations, 2.1 million in private donations. 40K from town of Kremling, 70K from Silverthorne, 250 from Summit County, and the remaining 3.1 from Greene County. We did have, you know, a ranch landowner that kicked in about $4 million for that. And he put up a challenge to say, I challenge the rest of you guys to match this. And they had 45 days to match that. And that's where the remaining, the 3.1 and the 2.1 came in, is matching donations from the county and from private citizens. In 45 days, they raised that to get it to design. And once the design was finished, that's when the other governments could help kick in for to help with the construction. So it still sat, like once it got the money to be fully designed, it still did sit for a little bit, but again, it raised in the queue much faster and started construction within a couple of years after that. And that time frame is back here.
So that was.
I don't have that number with me, but if you give me your email, I can get that number for you. Yeah, I can probably get you to the right person. Michelle Cowarden and Julia Kench probably have that. There's a report that they do every year. I am happy to find that report and send that report your way. And it may have those numbers in there as well. Yeah, because there is maintenance. There's maintenance with fencing that has to be done and deer guards and things like that all have to be kept up because there's a lot of different driveways in this area. We'd like to have buy-in. Yeah, it would be better. I think technically if it's in CDOT's right of way, they could say, well, we're just doing it, but that's not the way we want to operate. We want to have buy-in. We've had meetings with a majority of the landowners between Silverthorne and Green Mountain Reservoir. They've been attending meetings for the past 2 years for that area. And we've looked at some sections near the Mount Powell Ranch, and there's some different things that we're considering in that section, but we are actually now starting to focus efforts, and we'll see where it lands. There's no definitive areas at this point in time. That's where our engineers are going to help us decide. We're now looking at lands that are going to be either Summit County open space or Forest Service on either side that would tie in. They would actually be on the north end of Green Mountain Reservoir. That's what we're going to be looking at next week. So, but yes, we want buy-in. We want buy-in whether it's adjacent to your land or not. We would love people to be involved and help us with ideas and help us to get folks to get their buy-in as well, because it takes everybody to be on board with this, because it's an expensive project. Again, $66.4 million a year in Colorado versus, say $15 million for a system of structures. A whole system, and you take away, you connect genetics again, you allow animals to breed that haven't bred in decades, and then you take down that risk of driving on the highway as well.
So I just want to understand that last slide you had.
Was it this one?
You've got about 5.5 million there. That's for that portion of Highway 9 up to Kremlin. How many structures did that build?
So this isn't totally accurate on what the structures built. So it was a highway transportation project that also included 7 structures. The entire highway project was about $50 million. 50 for the highway transportation. That included turn lanes and wider shoulders and everything else they did there. And I'm not an expert in that area because I wasn't on that project. The wildlife crossing structure portion of it was about 20% of that. So roughly 10 million or so was the wildlife crossing structure piece of that.
And there were 7 structures?
7 structures, 2 overpasses and 5 underpasses that were arch culverts. Let me tell you something though. They have the most perfect terrain to work with up there that you could ever imagine. There are lovely little road cuts and the perfect drainages, and they all happen to be about 1 mile apart, which is ideal for, I've got a crossing here and 1 mile and a crossing here and 1 mile and a crossing here. It's ideal. Not every place is going to be ideal. Not every place is going to cost $10 million for 7 structures. Most places are going to cost a lot more than that. Some are going to, one structure might cost $500,000. It really does vary on where it is, what the species is you're building for, and if it's a standalone project or if it's being incorporated into a highway transportation project. So costs can really vary. Yeah. Who else had questions? Yes.
Well, I was just wondering about the money. What if you don't get what you need?
I'm not considering that.
You have to.
No, I don't have to consider that right now. It's too early in the stages. And we have a team of people that are passionate about this. And
Tell us about your success. How are you getting that money? How are you getting those people?
so far our success has been, in the past, we just started this project 2 years ago. I mean, we just completed that plan, that document in 2017. We've already got $200,000, and we already have CDOT as a partner out on the ground with us this summer. We've got Vail Resorts and A Basin and Copper and big partners like that that are saying, we're in. I think that's a really good sign of success. We have CDOT. We also have a statewide wildlife transportation alliance that is helping us to steer this project as well. So this isn't just Summit County. This is a larger movement that's happening at a statewide level, and it's needed. And there's a partnership there to say, you know what, this is a big deal. But that's why it's important if we can get this to the design phase and get that piece finished. I think we have a very, very good chance of actually having it constructed. Yeah, if the community says, dang it, we funded the $1 million to have this design, and it's important, and our community wants to see these roads safer, and we care about our wildlife. CDOT, when are you going to do something about this? And that's when they start going, okay, you've done your legwork. And I don't think $1 million is a lot to ask from our community and from the visitors who come here, who use this highway, who create some of the impacts that our animals are dispersing from human pressure. They're dispersing from the traffic. They're dispersing from, all of those impacts that we talked about earlier. So I'm not ready to consider that.
Well, since
It's too early.
1997, I've been here.
Well, I don't think they're typically hanging out by the highways either. I don't like to hang out by the highway. But again, all those pictures we just went through, all of these are within 400 feet of the highway. Every single one. So they're there. They're just not hanging out right next to them. I was going to go here real quick. We are looking into every possible resource out there. Yeah, so we're just now starting to begin strategizing for our big capital campaign fundraising. But I'll be honest with you, and this is probably a little bit more of my opinion. I don't feel like this is necessarily someone else's problem to fund. I feel like these are our roads. This is our county. This is a place where we recreate. This is a place where we have impacted our wildlife. And I feel like it's not CDOT's job and not the Forest Service job and not everyone else's job to take care of us. I think it's our job to take care of us. And I think that the citizens in our community have a responsibility to get involved and to say, this is an important thing that we want to see happen. And if we make that happen, that others are going to come and say, we support this as well then. That's and off of the soapbox. Yeah. But we're looking into everything. Yeah. Yes.
We're part-time, we're out there a week at the right time.
The wildlife is here. That's for sure. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a job as the wildlife biologist. But they're here. Yeah, Carolyn?
That $66.4 million, is that per year or is that so far this year?
No, it's annually. It's an average annual dollar figure.
Okay.
Every year.
Yeah, but you were saying, you added up every time.
Well, every time CDOT or CPW, we get different figures from different folks. So every time that figure is updated, it's increased.
Okay.
Yeah, so we go to, we've had to redo our slides. Last time it was 59 million. It's I had 66 million now.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. That's the cost to society basically for property damage, emergency response vehicles, the cost for them to go. Let's see, let me pull up my slides again to see what all that covered. I don't have the entire breakdown of what that is, but cost in millions of wildlife vehicle collisions and property damage, injuries, insurance, hospital bills, and fatalities per year. So that's lumped, and then everything that goes into those costs.
Specific to the state or the county?
That was specific to the state. Yeah. It's really tough to break down per county.
Who came up with that number?
That number came from CDOT, I believe. CDOT. Or that could have come from the insurance companies. Yeah, I need to look back on that.
So you're saying what us residents should be weighing is that cost statewide compared to
a cost.
What cost again, figure-wise?
Like the cost of a wildlife crossing structure. So for instance, the very, very, very rough cost estimate that we got last year for 3 crossing structures, along with fencing and all of the traffic rerouting and annoyances that come with any kind of construction on Eastvale Pass for 3 structures would be about $15 million. $15 million for 3 structures versus 66.4. And again, that's just in one part of the state. However, that adds up annually. So when you really think about it, if we were to build more and more of these wildlife crossing structures, we're going to start seeing that 66.4 million go down.
And of that 15 million, that wouldn't all be taxpayer funded considering the partners and the pledges?
No, so far it's not been a dime of taxpayer money.
And is there a number again that you guys have raised so far to go toward that 15 million?
205,000. Yeah. Doesn't sound like a lot. It feels like every little dime feels like a big win though. When you get a partner that says, we're in, especially for the design piece, which is not the sexy piece. People want to see brick and mortar on the ground, but you can't build a wildlife structure until you design it. So you gotta believe in the design. You gotta believe in the design before you can get to the structure. So, and I'm really thankful to our partners at A Basin and Vail Resorts and the Center for Large Landscape Conservation for believing in the design and believing in the project, because you've got to do that first so that you can get to the good stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we know, like if the mountain goats over by Officers Gulch, we see them quite often there, will they use the Officers Gulch bridge will they go under I-70?
I'm not sure, and we've talked with Parks and Wildlife about that a little bit too. We think that maybe they wander. They go on the rec path sometimes. They might wander, but that's not ideal for them. That's not really an underpass since it's used by cars as well and by people. So typically, though, that goat herd stays separated. There's the 10-mile range herd, and then there's the Gore range herd, and they're different herds. That's more of a Parks and Wildlife question, but they're not using that on a regular basis. No, we do know that. Yeah, and it's nice to think that we could share bridges. We can't. They're not going to use them if we're hanging out on them. Yeah, so we need to separate uses, just like mountain bikers and motorcycles like to have different trails in the forest. Animals don't really want to be walking across the highway with skiers. Yeah, so it's similar to that. So there was another question. Was there one more?
Just real quick.
Yeah.
So the passage you mentioned targeting north of Green Mountain. Is that technically Summit County, or?
It is. Okay. So we were, everywhere we're looking is Summit County. So that would potentially, if those locations look to be engineering-wise feasible, then those would tie into the southern end of the Grand County project. Yeah, which would be great.
Gotcha. But like past the reservoir, driving past the cliffs, north of that.
Yep, because the Summit County line doesn't come in. A little bit of the fencing from that project is in Summit County, but the Grand County road doesn't hit until almost like the Williams Peak Road. Yeah, so we would be all in Summit County there. Yeah. I have stickers. Who doesn't like a good sticker? And I have business cards. So these business cards have our website on them and our email as well. The website has a lot of great information. There's also opportunities to sign up for the citizen science monitoring on Vail Pass. And more information if you're interested in the Vail Pass specifically. And if I blew over any information, I apologize. But please check this out and holler with any questions that you guys have. And if you're interested in signing up, you can do that here.